Hi, so today I'm going to give just a very brief overview of what is implementation science. Implementation science is about getting research findings into practice. So a recent study found that it takes an average of 17 years for 14% of evidence to make it into practice. And so that's from the one side when, a priority is identified for funding to the point where it actually gets into practice. So even after 17 years, only the tiniest fraction of evidence gets into practice. And so the points of implementation science is really to reduce this, to find ways to really get, things that we know can work into the field as quickly as possible. The definition of implementation science is the scientific study of methods to systematically promote the uptake of evidence-based interventions into the real world. So let me take that apart. It's a scientific study of methods. This is a methodological science about being systematic, about bringing things that we know work in very clean and controlled circumstances into very messy real-world settings. So where does this fit on the health research continuum? On the one extreme, you have, the basic science, animal models, then it moves into safety, making sure it's safe in humans in a very small amount of very few people. Efficacy is a slightly larger trial to see if it works again under very controlled circumstances. Effectiveness is seeing if it still works with a little bit more diverse population. And dissemination and implementation science is, does this work? Can this work in the real world? If so, how, when, where, all of those questions. So let's start first by talking about efficacy versus effectiveness. So for efficacy trials, in terms of validity, efficacy trials have way more internal validity than they do external validity. So what do we mean by that? We mean that under very, very controlled, strict circumstances, we know that this can work. What we don't know is if you remove the intervention from those very controlled circumstances, if it's still going to work. So in other words, it's internally valid, but it's less generalizable to the real world. In effectiveness, external validity is higher than or equal to internal validity, but it's still not at the level of real world complexity. It's more generalizable, but not fully. The sample in an efficacy trial is very, very controlled, very uniform. You can rule out people who have any, comorbidities that might, get in the way of, or any sort of confounding variables. Whereas in effectiveness trials, the sample looks a lot more representative of the general population, but it's still fairly controlled. The implementers in an efficacy trial are qualified and motivated. So this would be, your training providers to deliver this intervention in these circumstances. These are going to be highly motivated individuals, well trained. In effectiveness trials, it's a little bit more mixed, right? Because we're going a little bit more towards the real world where, people have different motivation levels in the real world and people aren't always at the same level. And so for outcomes, in efficacy trials, we can have very standard, rigorous, extensive, long outcome measures that are very detailed, whereas in effectiveness, we're thinking in the real world, we're trying to think about minimizing the burden on people responding to answers. And so we want to keep things sort of, effective, but simplified and brief. And in terms of data analysis efficacy, we use standard methods. In effectiveness trials, sometimes we need to use special methods to allow for heterogeneity and missing data, and data not missing at random. So now let's talk about the effectiveness trials versus implementation and dissemination trials. So what's the difference between an effectiveness trial and an implementation trial? Well, it really comes down to the research question. So in an effectiveness trial, we want to know if the intervention can work in a more real world setting. In an implementation trial, we want to look at not just if it works, but if so, how, why, when, under what conditions, all of those implementation factors that need to be taken into account in order for that intervention to work in the real world. So there's multiple study designs that can help us look at these kinds of questions. In a clinical effectiveness trial, what we're looking at are clinical outcomes, and in the implementation trial, we're looking at implementation outcomes. In hybrid designs, which are called implementation effectiveness trials, we try to look at both, right? And so there's a few different types of hybrid trials. In one hybrid trial, we're more interested in the clinical effectiveness than the implementation research, but we have a few questions there just to make sure that we're looking at it a little bit. In a hybrid trial, type 2 trial, we're looking as much at the effectiveness as how, why, when, where, it's being effective. And in a type 3 trial, we're looking at mostly the implementation questions. We're also looking at a few of the clinical outcomes to get a better sense. So these are the three major types of hybrid implementation effectiveness designs. There's three main types of implementation science study. There's one type that's really looking at process of how evidence is translated into practice. The second is about looking at why, explaining how and why. So what factors influence whether an implementation study or intervention worked or didn't work. And the third is evaluating the implementation itself. And when you get into this a little bit, you'll start to notice that there's a lot of models, frameworks, theories. This paper at the bottom is very excellent, making sense of implementation theories, models, and frameworks, because it gets very complicated. There's process models, determinant frameworks, classical theories, implementation theories, evaluation frameworks. And in my opinion, it ends up being kind of like a word soup. And so what I'm going to try to do today is sort of deconstruct that a little bit. First, I'm going to talk about process models. And these are models that generally define sort of the steps, the phases, the progression of activities that need to happen in order to translate research into practice. So I'm going to show a few different examples. So this first model was developed by Milton Weinberg and colleagues in Brazil, and it describes a model for how to adapt evidence-based interventions to a new culture or a new setting. And it describes this process, this adaptation process, as an iterative process where there's a constant sort of effort to balance fidelity and fit. So we want to make sure that on the one hand, the intervention is adequately adapted to the new setting so that it's most appropriate, but at the same time making sure that when you start moving away from and making all these adaptations, that it's still actually the same intervention. So this is the EPIS framework, which stands for Exploration, Preparation, Implementation, and Sustainment. And again, it's describing the process, the steps that one needs to go through in terms of adapting an intervention to a given setting or translating research into policy or practice. And then it specifies which factors need to be considered, including the context and bridging factors, innovation factors. And it's also like the Milton Weinberg's model. It's also an iterative model where you go through the phases, but then you might go back and sort of in a circular way. This is by Ahrens and colleagues. And this one, Dynamic Adaptation Process, builds on the previous one by Ahrens. And you'll see here at the top, there's the EPIS framework with the 4 steps, again in an iterative way where they sort of feed back to each other, but with a lot more detail about the different steps and theoretical connections between different factors. And this one is about the idea that you might adapt an intervention to a setting at one time, but then as the setting changes, circumstances change, you'll need to dynamically adapt the intervention to sort of keep up with the times. And so the idea behind this model is to do so in somewhat of a systematic way instead of sort of kind of drifting away from the original intervention and sort of possibly losing fidelity along the way. The dynamic sustainability framework by David Chambers and al. Is also another similar model that talks about, you know, the need for adaptation to be, you know, adapting needs to be dynamic over time in order to enhance the sustainability, because maybe if you start with one intervention and you don't adapt it, then it won't be sustainable over time. So it's another approach to systematically make sure that you're helping the intervention or practice to evolve over time, but in a systematic way. Implementation science is also very theory driven. So I'm going to talk about a couple theories that are frequently used in implementation science studies. One is the theories of change model by Prochaska and Clemente, which talks about the different phases in which a person would go through in their preparation for changing behavior. And it was applied initially to the context of substance use, and the pre-contemplation being, I'm not even thinking that there's a problem. Contemplation, I think there's a problem, but I'm not ready to act. And then preparation, I'm preparing to act, but not yet doing it, action and maintenance. And again, this process. But the theory of change here, particularly the readiness to change element of this model, has been applied to a lot of implementation science. So diffusion of innovations theory was developed by Rogers in the 1960s. And this is one of the theoretical models that's probably most drawn upon in implementation science. And it's this theory of how do innovations spread across a network. And so in this, he's talking about diffusion, meaning sort of the observational, passive, looking at how things spread, whereas in dissemination and implementation science, these are active strategies to influence the diffusion, to influence the adoption of these practices. So in his conceptualization, there are three factors associated with adoption and diffusion of innovations. The individuals themselves, personality characteristics, which I'll talk about in a minute, the context in which you're implementing, and then characteristics of the intervention itself. And you'll see these come up again and again in some of the other frameworks and models. But this graph here depicts his theory about that people are generally, in the general population, somewhere on the spectrum of like more innovative and less innovative, like the laggards. So more innovative people are the type of people who they hear about something new and they want to do it right away. Early adopters are people who, once they see other people doing it, they're like, oh, that looks cool and I want to do it. And then that curve goes all the way around to, laggards who might never do the intervention. They're just not interested at all. And so this is one of the individual level factors that can influence whether or not an intervention is taken up. Here's a model that was developed in the context of HIV adherence, the Information Motivation Behavioral Skills model. And it basically, posits that in order for someone to adhere to treatment, for example, they must first have the right information, understand the importance of adherence. They must be motivated to take the treatment to get better. And then they need both of those things, and then they also need the skills to do it. And that ultimately these are the three main factors that influence health behavior. I'm going to share some examples of determinant frameworks, and these are essentially frameworks that attempt to bring together theories to understand, explore, and explain what are the factors that drive these outcomes. So many of these determinant frameworks, in an effort to synthesize and simplify understanding, processes in implementation also can get very complex. And I don't know, when I first saw this model, I was somewhat overwhelmed by it, too many moving parts, and I had difficulty figuring out how I was going to actually apply it. But then when you look closer, you see that it's really drawing on some of those theories that we just talked about. So if you look at the top left, the innovation, the relative advantage, compatibility, complexity, that's all brought directly from diffusion of innovations theory from Rogers that I just mentioned about. On the far right, you see system readiness for innovation, and that draws from the trans-theoretical theory of change. Right below it, the adopter, that has to do with the laggard to innovator spectrum. And so these frameworks try to bring all of these things together and in a way that you can make sense of what you're observing about implementation. They tend to be applied in the retrospective way. So looking back at an intervention and the way it played out, and then trying to analyze and understand what were the drivers of certain outcomes and how can we understand and explain it using a shared language. This model, or this framework, the multi-level framework for predicting implementation outcomes by Shadwar and colleagues, I found it intuitively appealing, especially in contrast with the one that we just saw, in that it's very concrete and helps to organize in a systematic way, thinking about what are the factors that influence outcomes. So in this case, the structure or the society or the policy context. The organization might be the implementation setting, so be it a primary care clinic. There are factors related to the patient themselves and the provider, and then the innovation. The Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, or CIFR, is one of the best known and most used, I would say, determinant frameworks that's used in implementation science. And I suspect because it's attractively simple and easier to operationalize. And so it basically brings down the theory of what are the factors that influence implementation outcomes. If you recall, with Rogers in diffusion of innovations theories, he said individuals, context, and intervention. And you'll see three of those here: intervention, inner setting, outer setting, individuals, and in addition, this process variable. So the characteristics of the intervention, this is actually drawn exactly from Rogers' theory about the factors, the descriptors of an innovation or intervention that impact whether or not it's taken up in a setting. And implementation climate here you see under inner setting is drawn from that readiness for change and the trans-theoretical theory of change. All of these dimensions are defined specifically, and so it's sort of on the one hand nice and simple because it's just 5 factors, but then each one is defined granularly and can be applied to different studies in a way to talk about it in a systematic way. Another type of framework are the evaluation frameworks, and those are frameworks that help to evaluate and explain and organize the interpretation of implementation outcomes. So one of the most commonly used, and really I find it to be a very useful framework, is the RE-AIM framework. RE-AIM stands for reach, effectiveness, adoption, implementation, and maintenance. And so basically in a grant, for example, if you say you're examining your outcomes based on the RE-AIM framework, it just gives you a way to organize those findings. So the reach is, how many people do I reach out of the targeted population? If I aimed to train 20 people and I only got 13, that's the reach. How effective was it? the adoption, how do I develop institutional support to deliver my intervention? So to what extent was this practice taken up? The implementation factors, which also moves into these overlaps with the frameworks we just talked about, and maintenance, which is looking at factors related to sustainability. So the reason why I described all of these, frameworks and models before was to give an overview of the idea of how many theories and models there are. A few years ago, Rachel Tabak did this review of dissemination and implementation science frameworks and models and theories, and categorize them based on a few criteria. And I think they found over 60 models and frameworks. So you'll see the first one is the diffusion of innovations, and a few down you see the REAIM framework. But these are some of many, 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 many models and frameworks to choose from. And they have a category that's also looking, are they looking at dissemination only? Are they looking at dissemination more than implementation? Are they looking at implementation more than dissemination? Are they looking at them equally? How operational are these concepts? How flexible are they? And then at which level do these frameworks address? And sort of the main point of this paper is really it's describing all these different models, but the main point is like, there are so many models. Stop making models. Choose one. There's all these different ones. Choose. It's not as important which one you choose, but in implementation science is that you choose one. And it's using these frameworks and theories and this sort of approach that aims to have create a shared language about implementation, and to be able to compare over settings in this complex process of adapting interventions to real world settings. How can we compare our strategies in systematic ways? And one of the main ways in implementation science is through these frameworks and theories. And just like there are countless models and theories and frameworks, the same can be said about D&I measures, dissemination and implementation science measures. There are many, 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 many measures that have been developed in the context of matching these different models. And so that's a whole other dimension of implementation science. That said, I will just say that a caveat is that most of these instruments have been developed in high-income settings, and so there is evidence that some of these tools just don't quite translate across settings, across resource-rich and resource-poor settings. And so this is a field, with the measures, there's still a great need for better measures that are simple and transferable, translatable, straightforward. There's still a need for good tools like that, and that's another whole area of the field, is developing measures for implementation science. Now I'm going to go over a few examples from my own work to sort of get a sense of how this comes together. So the first example I'm going to give is from a study that I conducted in Brazil, which drew from three theories, or two theories and one framework. The diffusion of innovations theory, which I discussed earlier, the theory and the study of how, why, and at what rate new ideas and practices are adopted and diffused within social systems. And again, in this case, the adoption and the diffusion are passive. And in implementation science, we want to take this theory and then think about how we can leverage it to improve outcomes. And I'll explain how. It also draws upon social network analysis, which is both a theory, a method, and has the goal, but basically a study of how individual actors are influenced by social relationships in networks. And I'll describe that. And then the determinant framework that I used was this one by Shadwar, which identifies 5 factors that influence implementation outcomes: the structure, organization, provider, patient, and intervention. And I basically mapped the Rogers theory onto this determinant framework. And so you'll see Rogers identified 3 factors: the individual, the context, and the intervention. So here we see the individual, which is the providers, the patient, and the organizational context. We have the context, which is the city, as well as at the clinic level, and sort of policy factors and other factors that are both at the individual level, these providers within a setting and a team setting, but also in a structural way. And then factors related to the intervention itself. And so the way I operationalized this was first to say, okay, so the individual factors based on diffusion of innovations theory is that people have different personalities, and there are people that are inherently more innovative than others, and are likely to take up a new practice or new innovation faster than others. So this is the individual dimension. The contextual dimension is based on social network analysis, and that's basically, or combining the two, which is that in the diffusion of innovations theory, he says, he posits that that the more exposure, that basically across these groups, more exposure means that people will have greater readiness to do something. That people on the far left, they don't need any exposure at all. They hear about the idea and they want to do it. The other people need more exposure. They need to see other people doing it, etc. And that goes up exponentially at the end. And what that means for, and more specifically, is that think about these, the green ones are people who are doing an intervention, and that the network exposure, it influences, and their personality type combination influences the uptake. So early adapters, person A only needs to see one other person doing it and they're like, I'm in. The middle group is, they have 3 people in their network and then they're like, oh, that sounds like a good thing. Late adopters are, most of their network is doing something. 80% of their network is doing some practice, and then they become interested. And of course, the laggards would be the ones where everyone in their network is doing it and they may or may not even do it. And finally, the conceptualization of the intervention level factors is drawing upon Milton Weinberg's model. And this, the degree to which you've effectively balanced fidelity and fit with an evidence-based practice will be the determinant of acceptability and feasibility, and the likelihood that this intervention is to be taken up. Another quick example is taken from information motivation behavioral skills model or theory, and this is a theoretical model to explain how intervening and treating depression and hazardous drinking would impact TB adherence. And so it's using that theoretical model of information motivation and behavioral skills and showing precisely how that would be operationalized. So information, clearly the person needs to know the importance of adherence in terms of being cured. At the motivation level, treatment for depression or hazardous drinking, if someone's if someone's depressed, they might have very low motivation to take their medications, for example. And in terms of skills, someone who is an alcoholic and is intoxicated all the time, their skill level might be, they might be motivated to take treatment, but they just forget. And so this is how, and these 3 factors influence TB adherence, hypothetically, and ultimately TB outcomes. So this is another way of taking a theory and plugging it in to explain relationships. And that's all for now. It's fairly complex, and I'm hoping this overview just gave you an idea of the field, the complexity of it, but also the richness, potential richness of implementation science.